It's brains versus bravery in this SDRL doubleheader as our drivers take on the twisting precision of Hungary's Hungaroring before unleashing raw courage on the brutal high-speed streets of Baku. 2 circuits, 2 extremes, and the singular fight for championship points. Our reserve lineup for the doubleheader starts with Jean-Claude in at Red Bull, Xbox at VCarb, Rob Kaz at Williams and Kai at Sauber. Quali for this doubleheader is a single lap around Hungary. Let's hope everyone warmed up before joining the lobby. It was Barbans who brought home the single lap pole with a 1:14.5, 0.6 faster than Takubi in P2. The times down to P7 stayed within the 1:15 mark, with the grid dropping to 1:16 down to 1:19 at the back. Perhaps the biggest shock after quali was the unexpected and heavy downpour of rain, making for some interesting setup and tyre decisions for the grid. 14 of the drivers went for full wets and 6 brave souls went for inters. On the front row, Barban sported wets with Takubi on inters. The start of this race would be interesting. On the second row, Max and Alex were on wets. Third row, Mars and Orax both on inters. Fourth row, Kai was on inters, with Bradders on wets, and the fifth row had Epa Ake and Kilza on wets. Working to the back of the grid, Wins and Nick Flies were on inters, with Josh, Shan, Rando, Xbox, Rob Kaz and Berkey on wets. The answer to our questions on tyre choice was immediate. The inters were problematic, with Takubi gliding into turn 1 and losing part of his wing to Barbans' gearbox. Amid the chaos, Alex eased into P2 and Bradders, who has been impressive this season, slid into P3 as Takubi continued to struggle with grip. Mars, also on inters, had to go deep too, although largely to avoid Takubi. Bradders would further improve on his P8 start by moving through the mayhem into P2. The rain added a level of chaos we might not have expected in Hungary, especially with the championship leader dropping through the grid in these early exchanges, and some of our midfield drivers grasping the front of grid opportunity. By lap 3, the wet displaced a great deal of the water, and the inters started coming into play. Notably, the McLaren duo of Orax and Takubi began moving up the field. Orax seemed to have the better measure of the inters through these first 5 laps, with Takubi gradually finding his way too, taking P4 from Alex on turn 12 and setting off up the track after his teammate. Orax seemed to be the driver with wings though, not only extending the delta to his teammate behind, but catching Bradders for the P2 slot at the beginning of lap 7. Bradders seems to have stepped up a level this season, but could also do nothing against the indomitable Takubi barrelling down to turn 4. By lap 10 it was clear the inters were the tyre, and the question for those on wets would be when to pit. Barbans blinked first, dropping into the pits for inters, and picking up a 10-second speeding penalty as he did. The gaps at the front of the pack were so large at this point, the penalty might not have such an impact, especially against the other drivers on wets. We would soon find out. By lap 19, everyone who started on wets was now on inters, and Alex and Rando were skidding about on slicks. The front 2 of Orax P1 and Takubi P2 were on 18-lap-old inters, with no obligation to pit beyond the looming presence of Barbans in Takubi's side mirror. Now in P3 and on fresher inters, Barbans was riding Takubi's slipstream and looking for an opportunity. Rob Kaz's DNF into the barriers of turn 3 saw our only safety car of the race. The turning point. A chance for the pack to bunch, for Barbans to switch to slicks, serve his penalty and not lose position, and to set up a 3-lap race for the podium. The big question would be whether to gamble on the track staying damp and stay on inters, or gamble on the track drying enough to make slicks viable. As the safety car prepared to pull in, Orax in P1 was on mediums, Takubi in P2 on new inters, and Barbans P3 on softs. Softs were also the choice for everyone behind Barbans, back to P11. As with the start of the race, this start would tell a story in itself. Orax went for it coming into turn 13, seemingly taking Takubi by surprise, who in turn backed up Barbans. Maybe it was a team tactic. It worked. Turn 1 saw the terribly unlucky Bradders take Max Bean on the straight, but run his turn 1 exit wide, locking tyres with Max Bean and ending in the barrier. Bradders went from P4 to P8 in the blink of an eye. Wins would slot into P4 and Nick Fly's P5, although Wins' impressive stack of penalties would likely impact his final position post-race. It was perhaps unfortunate for Orax that his first race victory of the season would have such a hotly contested battle raging behind. His victory was almost an aside, as Barbant on his slicks tried every trick through the last lap to take P2 from a wing-damaged Takubi on Inters, only to fail at literally every turn. In the end, though, it was Orax who had the measure of both the Inters and the conditions. Orax took control of the race from the beginning and deservedly took the flag with a 6-second gap over Takubi, whose P2 was 0.02 of a second ahead of Barbant's in P3. Mars battled hard through the pack from his lap 1 turn 1 drop to P16, taking P4 on track a further 2 seconds back from Barbant's. Nick Flies would take a well-deserved P4, Mars P5, Kills a P6, Max Bean P7 and Wins P8. Bradders, despite all the trauma, still made it to P9 and Josh collected the final point in P10. Now on to Baku, where it will obviously be a lot less chaotic. The drivers lined up in Baku in a reverse championship grid formation, which put Nick Flies and Josh on the front row on mediums and softs respectively. Then Wins and Alex second row on mediums. Orax and Bradders were on row 3, also on mediums. Rando row 4 on softs, with Kilza on mediums. Working back from row 5, everyone was on mediums save for Shan on hards, perhaps hopeful of a late safety car. The race start went without incident for at least 200 metres. Then Josh turned into the wall at the first corner and kicked off a procession of safety cars that lasted through to the end of lap 8. As the safety car pitted for the last time, it was Mars who led, having decided not to pit through any of the previous 7 laps under the safety car. Nick Flies sat in P2, Orax P3, Wins P4 and Bradders P5. Our championship leader sat back in P7, with Barbans way back in P16. Berkey, Shan and Josh were all DNFs. Lap 8 was notable for the fact the safety car was now all out of petrol and crashes would have to be driven round or through, of which there were at least 2. One occurred at the castle with Bradders into the wall, which resulted in at least 2 immediate DNFs. Amid the chaos, Takubi managed to squeeze into P4 with a 2-second gap to make up to his teammate in P3. Heading into lap 9, Mars held P1 but had yet to pit, Nick Flies battling to hold the line in P2, Orax P3 and Takubi P4. Nick Fly's battle for the podium took a knock coming out of turn 2 when Orax snuck up the outside and took P2. Just behind, the Red Bulls of Lay and Jean-Claude came together at turn 3, and then Kai and Jean-Claude came together at turn 6, stacking up cars behind and leaving the track wide open for Barbans to take off. He didn't need a second invitation. Barbans would then chase down Lay, who'd managed to skip away from the turn 6 mayhem, but couldn't outrun the Hungarian. A few turns up the road, Nick Flies was now busy fighting off Takubi, and you'd imagine come the race end would be glad to have the McLarens out of his rear view. Nick Flies managed to hold on until the straight, but had nothing more to give, and gave way to the championship leader. Mars finally came in for his obligatory pit stop, the drivers back to Lay all jumping up 1 position over Mars. By the close of lap 13, Mars was back into P5 ahead of Lay and chasing down Barbans and Nick Flies. Heading into lap 14, the front of the grid had a familiar look about it, with the forced disruptor being a very resilient Nick Flies, sandwiched between the 2 McLarens up front and Barbans then Mars behind. Although Mars had a lot of driving to do, albeit on very fresh tyres, to catch Nick Flies and Barbans. Coming into lap 15, the question of whether Orax could top-step the podium twice in 1 week was answered, when Takubi made the pass to take P1. A lap later, Barbans would finally take P3 from Nick Flies. With 3 laps remaining, Barbans' task was now to build a 3-second delta over Nick Flies to cover off his penalty. At the front, McLaren had the points sewn up. The question would be whether Takubi could hold off a points-hungry Orax. Into lap 18, Orax was poised, but a wobble through the castle cost him a couple of tenths, and enough of a gap for Takubi to breathe easier through the remaining half lap. Takubi took the flag, Orax P2, Barbans 3 seconds back in P3, and Mars stunningly took P4 from an unlucky Nick Flies, just as the checkered flag appeared through the heat haze. Max Bean once more would finish with a good stash of points in P6, Lay P7, Epa Ake P8, Rob Kaza dogged P9 and Kills are rounding out the points in P10. Given the nature of the chaotic race start, finishing was a reward in itself, which means Rando and Kai are also worthy of a mention. We had 8 DNFs. Looking at the Drivers' Championship, Takubi has a firm grip on the trophy as we near mid-season, with Mars keeping himself in contention with consistent high points finishes, and Orax reaping the rewards of a P1 and P2 this week. If Barbans keeps showing up, he'll surely be battling amongst the leaders too. As in the real world, McLaren seem to have the constructors sewn up, with Aston Martin and Mercedes fighting it out for the big bucks offered through runners-up honours. Next up is the Italian GP at Monza. See you there.